Good evening, everybody. I think we'll get started. Welcome to this discussion this evening, hosted by the Center for Policy Research and the Initiative for Climate, Energy and Environment at the Center for Policy Research. My name is Navroz Dubash. I coordinate the initiative. We're very happy to have with us today some very distinguished panelists who I'll introduce in a minute. But I just want to set the tone a little bit for the conversation we're about to have, which is about a book called Titans of the Climate, which goes into the background of the China-US climate deal, which was put out by President Obama and President Xi Jinping in November 2014. And I remember actually the moment, as somebody who tracks the climate negotiations quite carefully, when we heard about this. I was actually part of a track 2 conversation between India and the US, and I think several others in the room. I think Ambuj was there, if I'm not mistaken, and Krishnan Dhawan and others. We were part of this conversation with several high-level people in the US. And news came filtering through that China and the US had come up with this joint statement where they were going to talk about their pledges that they ultimately put forward at Paris and come up with some very important language that subsequently would shape the Paris Agreement. I remember thinking that a lot of the discussions we've been having in our little closed two-day meeting were immediately going to be rendered somewhat irrelevant. The game had more or less been set for the next year. And I was always very curious about how this feat had been pulled off. So I was really quite delighted when I heard from Professor Gallagher, who I'll describe her work in a minute, that she was coming to India, and I thought we had a chance to actually dig into the background behind this deal. It was extremely influential. It set the framework for the Paris Agreement, and I think it's also extremely interesting that it was built on a lot of painstaking domestic conversation between China and the US on how energy policy operates in those countries, which we'll hear about in a minute. So I thought it would be interesting to convene a discussion to actually ask, the subtext really of this conversation is to try and explore what can India take from this? What sorts of diplomatic initiatives, what kind of national policy conversations, what kind of bilateral conversations can we now reflect upon in an Indian context, drawing on this very intriguing story and very influential episode in climate diplomacy and in climate national policy making. So with that brief introduction, we have a great panel with us today. I'm going to introduce all three of them together. So to start with, our visitor, Professor Kelly Sims Gallagher, is Professor of Energy and Environmental Policy at Tufts University at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. She directs the Climate Policy Lab there and the Center for International Environment and Resource Policy. From 2014 to 2015, she served as Senior Policy Advisor in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy and in the US State Department. She's the author of several books, including the one that we're going to talk about today. After Professor Gallagher presents for about 25 minutes or so, we'll turn to our two discussants. The first of whom is Ambassador Shivshankar Menon, who is, I'm sure, well known to all of you. Ambassador Menon served as National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister of India from January 2010 to May 2014, and was Foreign Secretary from October 2016 to July 2019. That's right. So I'm sorry. October 2000. I should really just pull out my glasses and okay, October 2006 to 2009, to July 2009. There we go. He is currently a visiting professor at Ashoka University, a distinguished fellow in the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings, India, and chairman of the advisory board of the Institute of Chinese Studies in New Delhi. So Ambassador Menon pushed back pretty hard when I asked him to do this, saying that this climate policy was not really his bag, but I managed to prevail upon him by saying that we were very keen to have somebody with the deep knowledge of China that he has, as to many others. I'll move right along. But I really, really thank you for agreeing to to join this panel and look forward to hearing your remarks. Also on the panel is Professor Ambuj Sagar, who is the Professor of Public Studies, Policy Studies at IIT Delhi and the founding head of a very exciting new venture, the School of Public Policy at the Indian Institute of Technology. And I think we all owe Ambuj a big thanks for this work that he's doing to build the landscape in our area of interest. Ambuj works at the intersection of technology and development, including on innovation policy in a range of areas, including coal, automobiles, biofuels, and so on. So welcome and thank you, Ambuj. So with that, with those introductions, and I think you'll agree we have a quick panel, let me hand it over to Kelly. Maybe if you want to present.
Sure, I'll go stand up there. Can everyone see me if I'm down here? And
yes,
can you hear me? Okay, even better. Well, Navroz, thank you so much for putting this together, and Ambassador Menon and Ambuj, thank you for taking the time to come do it. I know everyone is busy, so I really am thankful to all of you for taking the time to come. This book is primarily a book about domestic policy process, and it is a comparative book where we try to look at the two countries, the United States and China, using the lens of climate policy to illuminate how policies are made and to demystify the policy process in these two countries. Today, I'm going to focus a little bit more on the international diplomatic relationship between the two, and then, happy to get into some of the domestic policy aspects as well. So let me begin by just talking about where did this title come from, Titans of the Climate. We argue in the book that the United States and China are currently the titans of the climate. And let me just take you back for a minute to ancient Greek mythology. As you may recall, the Titans were the original gods born from Uranus, who was ruler of the sky and the cosmos, and Gaia, ruler of the earth. And Kronos overthrew his father, who made a prophecy that his own children would rise up against him and overthrow him. And Kronos was so terrified that this would happen that he ate all of his children as soon as they were born, all except one, that was Zeus. And then Zeus, as leader of the Olympians, did indeed rise up and fight and lead the war, the Battle of the Titans. And this was due to unhappiness with Titan rule. I note his brothers and sisters were recovered through regurgitation. And so this is kind of reminiscent of climate change because the Titans were the gods and goddesses that governed the Earth's sun, moon, waters, lands, and winds. And the mortals lived in fear of them. Prometheus, one of the Titans, gave the mortals fire, which ironically gave us the ability to combust fossil fuels and produce carbon dioxide emissions. Taught them the art of civilization, and for that was punished by Zeus for all eternity. During this battle of the Titans, the mortals had to kind of live with the consequences. So there's no direct analogies that we're trying to make here, but there's a few allusions. The first is that no other two countries currently have as much influence on the global climate as the US and China. Here you can see total carbon emissions. This is absolute emissions for China, India, the United States, and the EU 28. And China is that blue, the dramatic growth curve on that graph. Together, the US and China account for nearly half of global greenhouse gas emissions today. While China surpassed the United States in aggregate emissions in 2006 on a per capita basis, you can see that its emissions are far smaller. They're now, actually equivalent to European per capita emissions, which I think is kind of interesting. And of course, Indian per capita emissions are much, much lower than China's. On a cumulative historical basis, though, I think it's very important to remember China is sort of just beginning its contributions to global greenhouse gas emissions. And you can see the EU actually accounts for the large historical majority, and the United States, of course, especially around the US Industrial Revolution, post-World War II, also very significant emitter. So as we saw in the Obama-Xi era, when these two countries, these two titans, we can call them, can get along, they're capable of great leadership that arguably led to the breakthrough and the ability to achieve the Paris Agreement. But when they fight, which we're starting to get a glimpse of what that feels like, the rest of the world has to live with the consequences. And then the other much more of a stretch illusion is that leaders who are not just will be challenged. And I think if the United States and China don't find a way to manage their emissions, they will in fact be challenged by other countries, particularly the most vulnerable countries who are experiencing the consequences of climate change. It's hard to imagine them actually rising up and fighting against the titans, but certainly in terms of challenging the predominance of U.S. and Chinese emissions, I think we're already starting to see that. We start with the premise in this book that climate change is real. I probably don't even need to say that, but when I'm in the United States, one still has to say that, especially under this president. This map shows Earth's global average temperature from 2013 to 2017 as compared to the baseline average of 1951 to 1980. And this is a NASA graph, and you can see the reds are obviously where you've had the most warming, and we see really dramatic warming in the high northern latitudes, and particularly the Arctic region. But also significant warming in Africa and the Amazon basin, which is, of course, very concerning. The Paris Agreement, I just want to sort of place this in context for a moment, was this wonderful, great first step. It's far from adequate to actually prevent, highly disruptive global climate change. This graph shows that, business as usual, if there was no policy, what global greenhouse gas emissions would look like. That's the no policy baselines. Then that orange is current policy, and then you can see the darker orange is essentially the unconditional INDCs, the unconditional pledges, and then additional potential reductions if conditional pledges, which is essentially if developing countries get financial assistance, what they think they could achieve in terms of emissions reductions. So you put all of this together, and it implies a median warming of 2.6 to 3.1 degrees Celsius. So still far too high. We need to do a lot more. And we argue that the United States and China need to be able to find a workable relationship to continue working together in order to build upon the Paris Agreement. And their leadership and that of others, including India, will certainly be necessary going forward. So Navroz asked me to spend a little extra time talking about the two agreements, U.S.-China agreements, and how they came about. So the first one, which we called the joint announcement, was in 2014, November 2014. The second was we called the joint statement to differentiate them, came in 2015. So I think stepping back, many of you will recall what happened in Copenhagen in 2009 when all the countries of the world and all the heads of states converged in Copenhagen to try to achieve a deal, and it didn't come together. I think for the U.S. and China and the leaders, it was a particularly searing experience. President Obama was shocked by the experience. He could not believe the degree of chaos, the inability to be able to sit down and have what he thought were rational conversations. And I think he felt, terrible, actually, that he himself was not able to help deliver a global agreement in Copenhagen. And simultaneously, Wen Jiabao, the prime minister at the time, received a lot of blame in the media for the so-called failure of Copenhagen. And he, too, found it to be a searing experience. And I think both of them never forgot it. So even years later, when I finally got into the White House, this was where President Obama, started from. I think we also had a case in the United States where during President Obama's whole first term, the U.S. Congress was stubbornly resistant to developing a climate change bill. You may remember that there was a climate change bill that passed the House, the Waxman-Markey bill, but never passed the Senate. And President Obama had challenged Congress to produce legislation actually right after he was elected, before he was even inaugurated. And by his second term, he was fed up and ready to try to move forward without congressional support on domestic and international climate policy, and just announced in 2013 a climate action plan that had three components. The first was mitigation, domestic reductions. The second was adaptation and resilience. And then the third was, with hubris, international leadership on climate change, which is ironic because the U.S. had really never been, I think, a leader in the negotiations. But that reflected President Obama's ambition. And I think from the Chinese point of view, they had been acting very pragmatically for years to actually reduce emissions, achieve economic reform in order to start transitioning away from heavy, resource-intensive, energy-intensive industries to lighter industries, more strategic, green, clean, what they call the strategic emerging industries. And my prior book, which is The Globalization of Clean Energy, I had spent a lot of time in China interviewing firms, looking at how Chinese firms were sort of getting into the clean energy revolution. And I realized that China was way farther advanced than anyone in the US had really thought. And yet they were really kind of stymied internationally because the US was such a laggard. So this, what's been called the suicide pact between the two countries, where the US was blaming China for inaction and China was blaming the US for inaction, had just become this unproductive stalemate. And actually, my suspicion was that China would really welcome an international agreement. So after President Obama's reelection, I sat down and wrote a memo to the Obama administration and said, I think there might be appetite to do a US-China deal. I have to confess, I was really skeptical that the UNFCCC process would ever materialize with an agreement. So the memorandum I sent in said, just, for now, let's shift strategy and work on a bilateral basis, and then maybe go back to the global process. That was not embraced, I have to say, at all. But I sent the memo in. They called me down to Washington and said, are you serious? You really think the Chinese would want to do something like this? Could you please go and just float the idea as a crazy academic? So, Navroz and Ambuj, we can put on our crazy academic hat and put crazy ideas out there. So I went off to Beijing and floated it. And the Chinese government said, we think this would be very interesting. We would be open to this. So I reported back. And then a few months later, Secretary Kerry went to Beijing and put the idea on the table, and they said, yes, we would like to do it. And then I was invited to go down to Washington and join the negotiation team. So of course, I can't talk about everything, but there's a few things I wanted to mention about how we negotiated this deal. The first was that the Chinese suggested, as a matter of process, that we start with a technical exchange. What that meant was really just a depoliticized exchange of views by experts. So we had a whole series of meetings. I led it on the US side, and a long-standing friend, collaborator, Professor Zhou Ji, led it on the Chinese side. And we essentially put all of the modeling results on the table of what the US thought might be possible for it to achieve and what the Chinese side thought they might be able to achieve. And we had, a very clear range of possibilities, that was put on the table in the context of that technical exchange. For those of you who've ever studied negotiation, this emerged for me as the ZOPA, the Zone of Possible Agreement. And because we all knew each other quite well, these so-called technical experts, there was no politicking. It was really actually a question of what's possible, and what do we know and not know about what's possible for each country. US went through a very detailed bottom-up modeling exercise, policy by policy, to look at what it thought was feasible. The Chinese side didn't do a bottom-up. They had much more of a top-down modeling approach, but still they had a big range of views in their experts community. So we sort of identified this zone of possible agreement at the technical level and then kicked it back up to the so-called political level, which was led by John Podesta on the US side, and kind of alternately Zhang Gaoli, the vice premier, and Xie Jinhua, the minister and special envoy for climate change, and Todd Stern on the US side. We had several rounds more of negotiation. It was surprisingly non-political. I think one reason was that we really embraced this idea of nationally determined contributions. And so whenever, we got testy with each other, we'd remind each other of the fact that this is nationally determined, and the US had no say over the Chinese target, and the Chinese had no say over the US target. But we did push each other and increased ambition through this dialogue. And we finished the negotiations early. The target was the presidential summit, which was being held in Beijing. As you can imagine, this was of very, very high importance. It was politically very sensitive for President Xi. We finished the negotiations far in advance, and we were able to keep it secret until the actual summit. I know, at least on the US side, President Obama was hoping he could push the Chinese just a little bit more. And he didn't, actually, which is interesting. But anyway, we're able to make this announcement. I think it was a big surprise internationally, but in a really positive way, that these two former enemies in the climate change context had managed to come together. It also, I think, was very helpful and productive for the US-China bilateral relationship. Forget about climate. We had finally a bright spot in our relationship, and it exemplified this idea that we had a mature relationship. We could agree to do things together and disagree on other issues, and there were a lot of things we were disagreeing on at that time. In the climate context, though, the Chinese really interpreted this as a breakthrough on differentiation, this idea of common but differentiated responsibilities, and the fact that we had accepted a different target from China, that China's emissions would continue to grow and peak no later than 2030, was an explicit acceptance of a differentiated approach to these climate targets, the NDCs. And that language actually ended up being utilized in Lima, which was one of the rounds of negotiations, the last round leading into Paris that literally use the same language from the joint statement on differentiation. And I think also this initiated what I like to think of as a virtuous cycle, because other countries were inspired to come forward with their INDCs. Mexico, we had a lot of dialogue with Mexico, and they wanted to beat the Chinese in terms of their peaking year. So they ended up, picking a peaking year of 2026. I think primarily they just wanted to improve upon the Chinese target. Brazil, and others. So that by the time we got to Paris, actually almost every country had announced its INDC. And that ended up not being the controversial part of the Paris negotiations. I think the second, so I should say right after this, there was so much goodwill between the two countries. We initiated a domestic policy dialogue, which ensued for the next year and led to the second announcement, the joint statement, which was really a joint statement of domestic policy implementation decisions. So the U.S. announced its Clean Power Plan, heavy-duty vehicle emissions standards. There was sort of parallel announcements. The Chinese announced they would establish an emissions trading system for their power sector. And they also announced heavy-duty vehicle emission standards. We both had HFC regulatory announcements. So we tried to have these sort of parallel harmonized policy announcements. And the message that we were trying to send was, no matter what happens in Paris, we're going to proceed with implementation, and this agreement has already led to progress. So just a few thoughts about why all this was possible. First, I think there was ripeness. There was a policy window that had emerged for the reasons I described earlier. I think the technical exchange proved very important, and that's been validated, post Paris, as we've debriefed with each other. Now that I'm back in academia, I can go have those off-the-record conversations again. There were just no games in this negotiation, and I think that was because all of the experts who were at the table had known each other for years, had been working together for years on, academic papers and literally having exchanges with each other. Professor Zoghi had spent time in my group, and others in the experts group on the Chinese side, and I had spent time at Tsinghua University, which was where the lead expert, Hu Jiankun, was based. So we had, there was just no game playing during that process. So we were very efficient. And I think there was also perceived mutual interest on the part of both leaders, but for very different reasons. President Obama viewed this as a legacy issue. He had, made a commitment in the campaign that he had never forgotten, even though it seemed like he had forgotten it during the first term when he was so focused on healthcare reform. And I think it's harder for me to speak decisively about Xi Jinping's interests, but I think he wanted to have an international agreement, either Paris, like ideally actually a multilateral agreement, but second to that, a bilateral agreement was pretty good because it helped to justify his own desire to achieve these economic reforms and reduce pollution in the Chinese context. And I think we also had effective leadership on both sides. So let me just turn now back to the book and just talk about why we wrote it. We actually were inspired to write this book before Donald Trump became president. And one of the inspirations was this tweet in 2012, where he said the concept of global warming was created by and for the Chinese in order to make U.S. manufacturing non-competitive. This is a major narrative in the United States now. It's hard to believe. It's crazy. But it has turned from a myth to, a perceived reality in the U.S. context. And conversely, we see not the Chinese government, but different thought leaders, I guess you can say. This is a Chinese talk show host.
The slide is switched off would be better. We can't read
Oh, the lights?
this slide.
I don't know how to do that, but I can read it to you. So this talk show host says, these foreign bastards are so worried China will rise and surpass the United States because they're jealous of China. They even made up lies about China and other developing countries. These scientists are all puppets controlled by politics, Copenhagen liars, American liars.
What is his name?
His name is Ping Lang. So I just put these up here as two sort of counter myths, that have been asserted. And then I want to make the case that these myths become, if not challenged, become sort of a perceived reality. So we actually had China's Ministry of Environmental Protection write a paper saying the Copenhagen Accord was a conspiracy by developed nations to divide the camp of developing nations. Conversely, one of our more retrograde U.S. senators, James Inhofe, said Kyoto represented an attempt by certain elements in the international community, that being China, to restrain U.S. interests. A little more benignly, we have this argument, but I think this is just as big of a myth, that China's top-down engineering approach means it can set big goals and reach them. And Xinhua says Trump's rise is the fall of U.S. democracy because it illustrates the malfunction of the self-claimed world standard of democracy, since the American people don't choose a president who's responsible to lead the country. So what we endeavored to do with this book was to really challenge these myths and try to understand why and how we have policy outcomes that are puzzling to outsiders, puzzling to the other side. Because if we can sort of counter these myths and explain the reality behind them, maybe we can reduce the suspicion on both sides of the Pacific. So I don't want to take too much time, but I'm going to just run through very quickly our main conclusions about why policy outcomes differ. And we identified 8 factors. The first is party politics. Here, this is almost incomparable between the two countries. But actually, the role of political parties is very important in both countries to explaining policy outcomes. Of course, in China, actually it's a multi-party state, but the Chinese Communist Party is completely dominant and, as illustrated in this graph, diffused throughout all of the institutions in the Chinese government. They are part of the administrative state, they are in the judiciary, they are in the National People's Congress. So the party is the main means for coordination in China. But of course, in the United States, our two-party system has led to such an impasse. We cannot, even though a supermajority of Americans support climate change legislation, we cannot get a bill through Congress. And that really has to do with party politics. Second is separation of powers. This is a principle that is enshrined in the U.S. Constitution, and of course the main goal of separation of powers is to prevent any one branch of government from getting too powerful, and some of us are thankful for that in this presidency in the United States. But of course this separation of powers is not mirrored in the Chinese case. We do have a very strong administrative state that dominates over the judiciary and legislature in China. But really the Communist Party is exerting control throughout all 3 branches. Government hierarchy explains a lot of difference in policy outcomes in the 2 countries. So in China, there are 5 formal tiers of government. You can see ranging from the central government down to the township. And in the Chinese case, the central government is responsible for formulating policy, and the lower levels of government are responsible for implementing policy. The lower levels are allowed to formulate and implement their own policies, but they would never do that without the approval of all the higher levels. Whereas in the United States, we have obviously our federalist system where the state and the federal are essentially parallel and equal to each other. The federal government will directly enforce its policies at the local level, and the state can proceed with any policies it wishes to pursue without approval of the federal government, so long as state-level policies don't contravene federal law. So very, very different system, and this manifests itself in the difficulties that the Chinese have with enforcement, and the relative lack of difficulty in enforcement in the U.S. Context. Bureaucratic authorities are very interesting and different in the two countries. I noticed in our negotiations that one significant problem is that our bureaucracies do not match each other. So while we were doing all these negotiations, the bureaucracy in China responsible for climate policy was the National Development Reform Commission. Well, of course, we don't have anything like that in the United States. Perhaps the White House serves that coordinating function. But largely the EPA is seen as the lead agency in terms of U.S. policy, and all of the regulations that were passed in the Climate Action Plan were issued by EPA. So just who to negotiate with is a challenge. And there's a lot of confusion about who's responsible for what. Another example is China's Ministry of Science and Technology, and the best analogy for that is the Department of Energy. But when the Department of Energy would go over to China and see the Ministry of Science and Technology, the National Development Reform Commission would get very upset because they had authority for energy. So this confusion leads, I think, to a lot of misunderstanding. The next area of profound difference, and this really gets to the political economy of climate policy, is economic structure and strategic industries. In the United States, economic power in the energy industry is relatively easy for us to track because we can look at campaign contributions. Those are revealed and have to be reported. So the economic power of the fossil fuel industry in the last presidential election was very high. Contributions were 121 million from the fossil fuel industries compared with 1 million from the solar industries. In China, we see that the state-owned enterprises dominate all of the legacy traditional fossil fuel industries. Those are the state-owned enterprises. But we also have these strategic emerging industries that are all the kind of clean tech companies. And a paradox is that the Chinese government owns all the legacy industries, but is trying to, strongly move the Chinese economy away from those industries and to non-fossil sources of energy. Individual leadership is really easy to discern in the United States. I think everyone has heard of Al Gore, for example. Less easy to discern on the Chinese side, except for those who are really insiders and know Xie Jinhua or Minister Wang Gang, who is the architect of China's clean energy innovation revolution. But I think individual leadership matters very much in both policy processes. This was one of the areas of similarity between the two countries. And the role of the media is a big topic, and I think I don't have time to get into it, but a big area of differentiation between the two countries. So let me just close by talking for just a minute about how we try to characterize the overall approach of the United States versus China to their policy making. And for my co-author, Xuan Xiaowei, and I, this was the hardest thing for us to do. I mean, it in itself was like a major negotiation. How would we characterize the United States? How would we characterize China? So the term we finally agreed on for China was strategic pragmatism. So this term sort of talks about how pragmatic the Chinese have been in their shift in economic reform, their approach to climate change policy. We argue that communist ideology is much more symbolic than motivational in China's policy process today. Clearly, the predominant goal of the party leadership, which you see on the screen right there, is maintenance of power. But one significant advantage, and the reason why we use the word strategic, is that the Chinese government plans. It strategizes. There's 5-year plans, medium and long-term plans, 50-year plans, 100-year plans. And as a result, they can do a long-term economic reform strategy. They can plan for longer-term climate change policy. And that is something we just don't see on the U.S. side. Also, with China's growing economic power, they're able to consolidate financial resources behind national priorities. So you can support strategic emerging industries and pursue a pathway of green industrialization. And I think they've done that very effectively, building up their clean energy industry. For the United States, the term we used was deliberative incrementalism. And here we emphasize our democratic system, which is indeed very deliberative. It causes most of our leaders, particularly those in Congress and especially in the House, who have 2-year terms, to have a very short time horizon for their policy objectives. We've seen in climate policy every policy change being repeatedly contested. So, the Obama-era regulations, which would have put the U.S. on course to achieve its Paris target, have all been halted or rolled back by the Trump administration. And that's a perfect example of our incrementalism. We zig, we zag, we move forward, we move backward. On other issues, but not yet climate, you can see that over the long term, often a societal consensus evolves over time, and you can get progress, but it's hard to see so far on climate change. And most elected leaders will tell you they just can't afford to think about something like climate change because they have to worry about their next election. And I think President Obama himself was told that when he was president and grappling with which issue to prioritize for his first term. So in conclusion, we would argue that we should not expect both countries to have the same policy outcomes. They have very different national contexts, national priorities. They're at different levels of development. But our goal is to encourage people to try to get a better understanding of the policy process in these two countries so that we can turn distrust into at least a healthy skepticism and maybe even a more pragmatic approach to cooperation. So let me leave it there. And thank you all. Let's not leave it on that slide.
Thank you very much, Professor Gallagher. That was really, really a great, even though very sort of time-limited tour of this very complex situation and how you and your colleagues found your way through it to a really, really interesting outcome and one that has shaped the policy space that many of us try and engage with. So thank you both for your work as well as your presentation. I'm going to turn to discussants now. Of course, expecting that each of them will come up with a 2-word synopsis for India's approach as well in the course of their remarks. But whether that's possible or not, Ambassador Menon, we'll start with
you. Thank you very much for the really remarkable summary of how policy is made in China and in the US. And the book itself is really a fascinating account of how that happens. I know nothing about climate change. Let me state that right at the beginning. But it seems to me the reason I found the book so fascinating was because 3 reasons. One, what India can learn from this process that the US and China went through, but also what it tells us about China and policy making in China. because the environment, climate change has been for some time in China a relatively open area. And this is going all the way back to Urumqi's time as premier, when China entered the WTO and so on. Right from the late 90s, NGOs were allowed to operate in this area. The official media was allowed to carry articles which were critical. And I think part of that is because of what she mentioned. The party actually is so integrated all the way up and down the hierarchy, all the way down to the township village level, that it sensed the ecological crisis that China was going into relatively quickly. And that, in some senses, is the advantage of a system which is very different from our system or the US system. But it also meant that that policy structure in China wasn't quite sure what to do with this, and therefore actually opened the space up. That it stayed open right through is really quite remarkable. And there I'm not really sure. I have no explanation for why this was so. There is individual leadership, clearly. I mean, starting with Urumqi, who was a master of what the Japanese call gaiatsu, using external pressure to do domestic change that you consider desirable, but might be unpopular with domestic stakeholders and vested interests in the system. He used WTO to do that to the Chinese economy, and successive Chinese leaders have used climate change negotiations to actually drive through changes in energy policy, in regulatory functions, and have actually moved policy decision-making from one organ to another, and thereby kept control actually in their own hands. It's quite a story of how policy can be made despite very strong vested interests, because there's a whole set of binaries to be reconciled, not just binaries actually, whether it's between the energy needs of the economy, consumers, producers, industry, and for me, the fascinating story here is how China managed to reconcile those and it was not just a top-down exercise. That, for me, is the first lesson for India, that we cannot continue to do this the way we have been doing it so far, which frankly is a New Delhi elite and the government deciding things on climate change and on these policies. And there is something to be said for, something to be learned, I think, from this account and from this book. But the other part that I found interesting was also the porosity of sovereignty. Many of the things that, now these are new states, the People's Republic of India, they might be old nations, whatever, but we're very jealous guardians of our sovereignty. And yet, when you look at the process that they went through, when I read the book, I was amazed at the degree of openness about their own economy, about their own society, and not just, I think Kelly understates it when she said it was apolitical. But nothing is apolitical. I mean, and especially not in things like energy use, and there must have been political decisions taken to make them apolitical, as it were, to take them out of political contention, because there is political contention in every system, ours, Chinese, it doesn't matter. The US and India do this in public, the Chinese do it privately, but it's still done, and it's part of the policy process. But that was really quite amazing. How much of that is because of domestic conditions, as I said, because of the ecological crisis at home, which they have actually taken steps to deal with? How much is because of the need for the external world? Because reform and opening had actually made China much more dependent on the outside world than she'd ever been in history before. And very much the same process has happened in India a few years later, but we're also in a situation where more than half our GDP today depends on the rest of the world. Which, if you take external merchandise trade, it's roughly around 41-42% of GDP now. And if you add services, it's way beyond 50. And it's the same, we're roughly in the same league with the Chinese. when you need the world, you therefore need to actually go out and be a decent citizen and start shaping outcomes in global negotiations. And for me, that's the part that I'm not quite sure. I think we have a perfect description here of how this process played out and how the Chinese negotiated it with the US. But I'm not quite sure whether we don't need one more book from you about how, about really why did this happen? I think there's a question there. Now that I realize that's politically sensitive. But as an Indian, the third thing that I took away from the book was, where is the great Indian middle class, which is so silent? If you look at the idea of a sustainable future, of building a low-carbon economy, of going into new areas, building a new economy, this is very popular in China. All the data we have suggests that the only other country where it's more popular is Bangladesh, which faces an immediate threat from sea rise. But in China, the levels of popular support for these policies are very, very high. That is not true in India. In fact, when you think of the air we're breathing in Delhi, you wonder, where is this middle class? What are we doing? And we have the opportunity to express it. But do you hear it anywhere in the election campaign that's now going on around you? And yet, clearly, so this for me was a bit of a shock. I have no answer. I hope somebody else who knows more about this can really tell me. But what can we expect now? Was this a flash in the pan? Was, 2015, 17, was that just a moment which is over now? Because none of this happens within a vacuum, and there is a political climate. I think some of that depends on how you answer the question about China-US relations. Is this a fundamental phase transformation that we see towards much more contention? Not decoupling, that's impossible for both these large economies, but towards much higher level of contention between China and the US? Or is this just another phase that's going to pass, a few difficult moments and then back? My own sense, frankly, is that this is a fundamental phase transformation in US-China relations, which is bad news for climate negotiations and for the larger sense of whether China and US, the two largest emitters, whether they can actually work together on climate change issues and drive the negotiations as they did before Paris. It worries me. Why do I think this is structural? Because, I'm not sure that the election of Trump, that the change in the narrative, and also the change in the narrative vis-a-vis the rest of the world within China is reversible or minor. I mean, China today behaves as, has now developed this narrative of a century of humiliation, of victimhood, which you would think for an economy which is on track to becoming the biggest economy in the world is a bit strange. But it also means that her responses in dealing with the rest of the world are very different. This is a very different narrative, by the way, from what you heard from Zhu Rongji, from Mao Zedong even, which was China has stood up. We've taken our future in our own hands, and we're proud of ourselves. That's very different from victimhood, saying we want an apology. We've suffered. And so you have a political context in both places which has shifted, and there are structural reasons for, I think, what we're seeing now. We're also in a low-growth world economy, which there's no sign of it going back to the glory days of globalization, or at least pre-2008. And much of this was an attempt to go back to those days, it seems to me, which people seem to have given up on today. So I'm not sure that the context today permits us to go back, but that's a worrying thought for me. I mean, I just hope I'm wrong, and I'd be very happy to be proved wrong by somebody as we go along in this discussion. I better stop here because I have other things to say, but I hope to say them later.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. At least I have several questions for you, but we'll save that for the discussion.
Ambuj, like that,
You go over there. A couple of slides over, sure. All right. Thank you very much for having me here, Navroz, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here with Kelly, who's a very old friend and colleague from way back. And so first of all, actually, I want to start with saying that I think this book is a terrific contribution. And really, I think it's for the kind of reasons that Ambassador Menon picked up on, which is kind of provides a very nice exposition of the systematic policy processes within these countries. And I'm going to come back to that towards the end of my comments. And I think also, I have to say congratulations for being able to bring two huge countries to the table to engage on an issue that is inherently contentious, political, and so I think that's an enormous achievement. Where I have a bit of a difference is what this resulted in, right? And I think this is I'll say that I think this is always, especially in the climate area, it's a question of interpretation. In fact, I wanted to start with a quote that I really like. It's by an author called Ursula K. Le Guin, who is a science fiction writer, and it's from a book called The Dispossessed. And the book starts with a wall. It talks about a wall, and it says, like all walls, it was ambiguous, two-faced. What was inside it and what was outside it depended on. I'm not going to get to this. Yeah.
You want to just...
No, that's all right. Just one line. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, I'm going to start again from the beginning.
So we get the full.
Exactly. So like an economist. Like all walls, it was ambiguous, two-faced. What was inside it and what was outside it depended upon which side of it you were on. So I think what I want to say is, one can really interpret, and I guess it's not just of this agreement, I think a lot of things in the climate arena can be interpreted really depending on where you're coming from. So I want to kind of just start with putting up a figure. Yeah. So this is a figure from the New York Times about this deal. Thank you. And at least my interpretation of this is, if you look at how the Chinese emissions are rising, and on the x-axis is the time, when they actually said they'll peak by 2030, you can just imagine where those emissions are going to go. So in effect, the Chinese bought themselves an enormous amount of headroom. If you look at the US emissions, actually the trajectory already was downwards more steeply than what actually the governments negotiated. Honestly, any of us who actually study the climate arena, this should not come as a surprise. The climate arena is an arena where basically it's a global commons problem, and most country parties have decided that their way of engaging with this problem is to try to take on the minimum commitment possible and pass the buck on somebody else. And while I think it was absolutely important for both China and the US to come together and figure out how to work together and how to push the global, how to push the world forward in the area of climate change, at least from my point of view, I think because this is necessarily a political agreement, it's a political agreement in which the two countries came together, sat down, and decided basically to give each other a pass. And it really did set the stage. It set the stage for this pledge and review system globally, where every country is saying, nobody else should ask us what actually we can do, but only what is it that we are going to be willing to do under some relatively conditions, because it becomes this game of, why am I going to go out and take on commitments if I don't know whether the other person is going to take on commitments. So in a manner of speaking, it has kind of become, instead of a race to the top, which is what one needed in order to address the climate game, or not a game, but whatever, with the climate problem, it has kind of become maybe not a race to the bottom, but certainly a race of holding back and letting somebody else try to take the first action. So I think I just wanted to put out this graph as an illustration, at least to me, of I think it was a chance lost. I think it was a chance for two major countries to come together and set the bar really high and set a benchmark so that other countries would actually be inspired to take on major commitments. And I think instead what we've got is a Paris Agreement, which is basically, to my mind, has taken us down a pathway of this pledge and review, voluntary commitments, which really is not, while in the background you have a climate objective, but it's really not driven by climate objective, because there is no way of saying that the sum of the commitments is going to be close to what we need to go. So I think, to my mind, I'm actually worried. I'm a little bit worried about where we are going. I mean, I cannot agree more that US and China are going to remain two major countries. But the question really to me becomes, are we going to be able to change the mode of engagement, not just of US and China, but also for other countries, so we're able to raise the game and address this climate issue in the way that it needs to be addressed. I'm just going to take you guys. I mean, I'm an engineer by training. I'm an academic. I cannot not show figures. So I'm going to show a few more figures, but I think some of them are a little bit illustrative of the point that I'm trying to make. This is data from Climate Action Tracker, and this is for China. And the black line is a historical trajectory. The blue line is basically what's expected under current policy scenarios. And the black line at the end of the blue line is really their INDC. So effectively, or what's their national determined commitments now. So basically, China's kind of not been, as you can tell, not been particularly ambitious in terms of really moving its curve away from a particular emissions trajectory. By the way, in the Climate Action Tracker, the red, orange, yellow, green is basically, from their points of view, how is this country contributing to addressing the climate goal? And red, obviously, for them is insufficient. This is the US. And unfortunately, I think at some point when the emissions were declining, at least under the current policy scenario, the US emissions are going to flatten out, whereas that the orange triangle is what really represents what I think the Obama administration had hoped to do. India, on the other hand, at least the Climate Action Tracker really likes what we're doing, and I think it's probably true because we've taken on quite significant targets. I think, in fact, if any major country has really taken on very ambitious targets, I think it really is India, which is basically on path to even go well below where we expect our global commitments to be. But now I want to come back to the story of policy making and capacity in the country, and also the point that Professor Menon raised, my last graph, which is a little bit complicated, but just bear with me. The solid lines here are installed capacity of solar photovoltaic in the country and the trajectory over time for these 5 major countries. And the dashed lines are the patents in that area. Effectively, and I'm using the patents as a proxy for industrial capability. And the point that I want to make here is that if you look at, let's take a look at the US. The US actually has significantly in the last decade or so greatly increased its deployment of solar PV, but it also had a huge innovation base in the area and has been continuing to innovate more and more. The y-axis, by the way, is a log scale. Please pay attention to that. China, on the other hand, actually started innovating in this area well before it started deploying. Well before it started deploying, and at some point it picked up its deployment significantly. South Korea, which is a brown line, actually started innovating way before, has picked up its deployments a little bit, but its deployments are an order of magnitude below that of China. Not surprising, because it's a much smaller economy. But then you have India. India not doing very well on innovation, as you can see. I mean, we are basically 2 orders of magnitude below everybody else in the number of patents we are putting out in this area. But somehow on deployment, we are actually taking kind of a global lead. That we are, in a sense, our deployment trajectory is such that it is really putting us into the lead. So the story that I want to tell here is a story of how different countries are thinking about their engagement with the climate domain. To me, Chinese story is a story of, I think you call it strategic pragmatism. Everybody's pragmatic. I think the Chinese story is a story of strategy, where they've actually decided that the climate story is one that links up with their other environmental problems, actually the point that you make in your book, and also with their economic transformation aspiration. And they have played it out very nicely, where they focus more on building up the industrial capabilities and then done deployment. India, on the other hand, I don't know if I can come up with a 2-word description that you wanted, Navroz, but story that comes out is very clear that we are being driven by climate considerations, actually a lot of it because global climate pressure. Once the US and China had actually decided to put a deal on the table, India had to put a deal and had to put an ambitious target forward. So I think we've been pushed by the global arena to take on ambitious targets, and yet in some senses we don't have our act fully together in terms of building up our industrial capabilities to get the kind of benefits that one can from that kind of deployment. Which actually really brings me to the point that I think which Navroz wanted us to think about, what does India take away from this? Ambassador Menon also talked about this. I think the story India takes away from this and the story from the experience of the US and China is that this is a really complex landscape in which you have to be, again to use your term, Kelly, you have to be very deliberate in how you do things. If you read the book, you see the amount of thinking that went into trying to figure out what are the kind of targets you want to take. And in the end, to the extent one wants to engage with the climate arena in order to make sure that one also gets other developmental benefits, that's a lesson we have to take away. That it's not something that happens easily. It's something that is doable. The Chinese example has shown us that. Actually, the US is also doing this quite well, despite it's not taking on deeper commitments. It is possible indeed to take on climate targets and also to get developmental outcomes that one desires. But that requires an enormous amount of work, enormous amount of hard work, enormous amount of expert analysis that links up to the policy process. So we need both a supply side of analytical capacity, and we also need a demand of the analytical capacity within the government. And the two really have to be linked up in order for us to get where we want to go, which I think is along the same direction as China and the US, but hopefully even more ambitiously than them in the climate arena. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Ambuj. Sharing these sessions is a real privilege, but sometimes it's a little frustrating because I'm itching to jump into the conversation. I will give a hint that perhaps I'm on the other side of Senator Glynn's wall on this one, but we'll have that conversation. Let me then, we have some time for discussion. I would like to make this as conversational as possible. So I open it up. There's a microphone over there that we'll send around. Let me get a show of hands. So 1, 2, and 3, and then we'll take a second round after that. Please, Mandy back there. Gentleman, Risha.
I have a couple of queries. One of them is regarding that.
Just to say, please keep them very, very brief and just one question.
I'm keeping that very brief. I have a couple of queries. One of them is regarding the point that that China is using Belt and Road, and they are using a lot of their public sector, state-owned enterprises are using coal-fired power plants. While for domestic use they are using a lot more, latest renewable technology. So how these two things go hand in hand? And my second question is that regarding the US, US is, restricting its, technology, as far as, emission is concerned because of shale gas, shale gas is, natural gas are carbon intensive. They, emit methane and all, So don't you feel that shale gas is, restricting, renewable energy, solar, wind, in US?
Next, just to your left, please.
My question is to the professor. You said that India took an ambitious target because of the global
Sorry,
pressure.
they're all professors.
Yes.
Thank you. He's looking at us.
So
No.
India took a very ambitious target because of the global pressure you mentioned in your remarks. But is it just the only reason? Because I feel that it's more so because the solar prices have fallen drastically, and it makes sense for us to install more and more solar, given the fact that there's a lot of electrification that's occurring, and demand is much more lower than what it is in China or US.
Let's get the third question, please.
Yeah, my concern is about carbon. Everybody talking about emission of carbon to be cut down by 2030. I have the proposal that why not to make use of carbon to some other product. We know carbon chemistry is you starting from diamond is also carbon. So we can make hundreds of products from carbon. So why not to put some attention to convert carbon to some other product?
Thank you. Do you want to start? Sorry.
Yes, well, I would like to start. So I'm actually going to start with just a quick response to Ambuj because I can't help it, and this is our dynamic. It's such a healthy dynamic. No, it's a healthy dynamic. So I just wanted to say, I wouldn't go so far as to say we gave each other a pass. For the U.S., we calculated we would have to double our rate of reductions. So our Copenhagen target through 2020, then 2020 to 2025 actually, when you calculate it, is twice the rate of emissions reductions. The challenge was we could not see a policy pathway to go faster. So I think, and that's actually a really kind of subtle point. We were trying to figure out how could we get more ambitious. President Obama actually wanted a more ambitious target. I wanted a more ambitious target. But because we were constrained by Congress, and we could only pursue a regulatory approach, and we only had authority in the Clean Air Act to do certain things, it meant we were constrained. And I think that's a really important thing to understand about why we couldn't do better than we did. And I think on the Chinese side, I personally was disappointed by their peaking target, and I think there's no question they're going to peak sooner. However, when you look at that crazy chart, with the almost vertical emissions, I have to say the day the agreement finally came out, I had this sense of relief that, this seemingly inexorable rise was going to stop. I mean, after that peak, they actually have to bend that curve. And I think that is significant and worth praising them for. But I always thought and still think the binding target is their non-fossil target, which got way less attention, but I think is very important. So that kind of helps me talk about the coal to renewable question. And I think for lots of reasons, the Chinese government is really committed to reducing coal consumption, energy security, air pollution, and resource intensity. I mean, it's just wasteful to use lots and lots of coal. So I think, the big differentiator between the two countries is that China has no domestic resources of gas. It does actually have a lot of shale, but it's not accessible, economically accessible. So, I think China made a strategic decision that for energy security reasons, for environmental reasons, and for economic reasons, it wanted to make a big bet on renewables. And it made that decision early. However, most people don't understand that the solar industry in China is a private industry. It is not a state-owned enterprise industry. And I give the Chinese government a lot of credit, given that they are the incumbents, right? They are the owners of the big fossil fuel companies, Shenhua, Huaneng, those are all state-owned companies. They are essentially putting themselves out of business, right, through this transition. It's hard to imagine, many other countries being able to do it. But to your point, Ambassador Menon, about the politics, the internal politics are significant. I mean, it's not like it's easy to turn off, a coal-fired power plant or close a coal mine overnight, because there's jobs associated with that. There's local economic employment and growth. So this is a difficult process that they've embarked upon. And I think that's why they didn't go faster, is that they were very worried about being able to achieve this transition in a kind of economically fair and reasonable way.
Great, thank you. Yes.
Oh, sorry, the question on. So, actually the Indian solar story started well before. Our solar mission was actually launched in 2009. What happened in 2009? Copenhagen. So in some senses, my view is that our solar story was really partly as a response to the climate pressures. We actually needed to put things on the table in Copenhagen, and the solar mission was one of the things that was put on the table. The targets at that time were relatively limited, because at that time solar was really expensive. And in fact, I was involved in some of the conversations and doing the calculations of what it would mean to do the feed-in tariffs if you were to go to 20 gigawatts, which is initially envisaged. So I think in some senses, there is no question that our solar, our engagement with the solar has really been pushed by climate. To what extent it's climate, and to what extent it's other issues such as energy security or industrial competitiveness, I think that actually you can get to by actually looking at the policy we put in place, right? I don't think we put the policies in place to build a solar industry. So clearly it can't be industrial competitiveness objective. Even with 100 gigawatts of solar with the low utilization factors, the plant load factors, it's going to contribute to our energy still relatively small amount. So even on that side, in terms of energy security, it's at least a small piece. So honestly, in my own analysis, my view is that actually it was our need to be ambitious and not be seen as the bad person in Paris, because in some sense the narrative had been changed by the US and China as folks who were willing to do something. And we are the ones, or at least I felt, there was pressure on us, and actually other developing countries also, to take on something. I actually don't know where the 100 gigawatt number comes from. I don't know anybody who knows where the 100 gigawatt number comes from.
Okay. Clearly, it would be great if we had more time, but let's take a very quick second round of questions. Yes, one here, one there, and one from this side of the room.
I just have a small comment on a question.
You've just made it harder for me to pick you, but
About the graph that was shown.
this side of, all right, we'll take your very brief comment. Thanks.
Hi, Manu from Council on Energy, Environment and Water. I was slightly late and sorry to miss out to the interesting conversation. I would just make a comment and a question. I would actually like to differ with Professor Ambuj when you say that India did launch solar mission in 2010, but if you see the actual deployments happening in India, that only picked up after the tariffs actually fallen. So India is actually doing it because it makes economic sense and not because of climatic considerations. When they would have launched the mission because of climatic considerations, but it actually picked up because of economic reasons. Yeah. So just comment there. On the questions that discussants were arguing, what could India learn from this book? And my question is quite simple. So if India has to sort of partner with either United States or China, which of these partnerships would be easier, and which of these partnerships would be good for a clean Indian economy?
Hello everyone. I am the living manifestation of India's solar target because I represent National Solar Energy Federation, which has So I have two questions. One for the entire panel, that during COP21 India co-founded International Solar Alliance by comfortably neglecting US and China out of the alliance. So how do you look at it from the perspective? And the second question, which is more personal and domestic of US policy, is how do you look at the Green New Deal? Is it the old wine in new bottle, or is there something new in that? Thank you.
So very quickly the comment over there.
Yeah,
Why don't you start?
comment was the New York Times graph, which showed the US trajectory. The seeming dip was because of the recession, so that doesn't really capture the perceived trajectory. So we can't.
Let's take one more question. Right there, yeah, please.
Yeah, Hi, I'm a PhD candidate at Jawaharlal University. I work in climate negotiations. My question was largely, do you think, can we look at in the post-Paris scenario, can we still look at the climate change issue as a distributive justice question? And, or are we now looking at a great power rivalry sort of situation emerging in the climate arena as well? Thank you.
Okay, that's a many that to start. I'll answer with the last one, and maybe also the partnership question.
We're in this very strange situation where you can't expect any real progress towards a sustainable future without the US. And yet today, with the Trump administration rolling back, whatever work was done, most of what was done under the Obama administration, it's very hard to see them actually participating in a meaningful international negotiation. We can't do without China. And yet, you can't do it with only China and the US. And here I think I differ, because what China and the US have agreed doesn't solve the problem. And the rest of us have other problems, not just India, the small island states, all the rest of them. They have an agenda too, which matters to them. For many of them, it's a matter of survival. So purely as a negotiating problem, you're in an impossible situation today, because it's very hard to do what we all do, which is do that Venn diagram of intersecting interests and find the area of possible agreement where these interests overlap. Given the way the US defines their interests today under the Trump administration, it's very hard to make the case. But you can't sit on your hands and wait and hope. Hope is not a policy. There's no way that. So what do you do? For me, that's the question. And you need a practical solution to it. It seems to me you need to start doing issue-based coalitions on bits and pieces of the problem. Forget a global agreement. Forget trying, revive. And after all, if you think of it, the actual experience of implementing the global agreements, whether it's UNFCCC, whether it's Kyoto, the actual implementation was not that great. None of us kept our promises. The world didn't keep its promises. Let's not blame anyone. Montreal may be better, maybe. But Paris, you really think it's going to be implemented? No. So forget global agreements. Think on what works. Do solar, do whatever you need to, and start building issue-based coalitions. For me, that's the only way forward in this situation. As a negotiator, I speak without any knowledge of the substance of the issue, but that's what I would say go into to your question, because of the situation. As for who's a better partner, again, I would rather negotiate with both and work with both, because that's the only way you're going to get a problem. You want a market out there, right? So work with both of them.
Well, on the International Solar Alliance, I think that's a good initiative. I support it wholeheartedly. It's a little bit confusing, to leave the major manufacturer out. Actually, it's not so confusing to leave the U.S. out, although, as Ambuj pointed out, although we have not been great at the manufacturing side, we have been and continue to be, I think, a significant player on the innovation side. Yeah, Germany's also out. But I still support the idea. I think it's a nice example, actually, of an issue-based coalition. And I very much agree with you that we need to do much more what I would call complementary agreements. And that's a perfect example. On the Green New Deal, this has, of course, been instantly politicized in the United States. But if you actually go through and read the resolution, it's very interesting. setting aside all the social programs, which I do not feel qualified to comment on, but if you look at the sort of green parts, a lot of the things are not hard. You know, I went through and I classified each initiative that they sort of put out there as hard, easy, you know, hard, medium, or easy, and half of them were easy. So I just give you the example of doubling energy R&D. This is something Ambuj and I have been working on for way too long. You know, for the U.S. government in our R&D budget, like 58% of the R&D budget goes to the Department of Defense. So if you just take a teeny tiny portion out of that budget and put it into the DOE budget, you could double, you know, overnight, and that would not be hard. I mean, I've put that in the easy category. What's hard is this ambition to go to 0 in 10 years. That is, I think, a worthy goal, but I think not necessary and not sensible from an economic point of view, because that's implying, you know, a complete turnover of all of the capital stock related to energy in the country. For sure, we should not be building any new coal-fired power plants, but we're not anyway. We probably should not be building any new gas plants. We're doing a lot of that because of the shale revolution. So I think the ambition is really good to say we're going to 0. That's our goal. We're going to have a stretch goal. But it's hard to imagine, especially all of our power plant infrastructure and the buildings infrastructure, how you completely rebuild all of that in 10 years. So that I put that one in the hard category. But it's high time. We need to do this. And I really welcome the initiative because, you know, I think there's a lot of appetite for infrastructure renewal in the United States. That's one of the few things I think the Trump administration might be able to productively do with Congress. But if we're going to do that, it's got to be green. And so I think they put the marker down exactly at the right time and in the right way.
Can I just make one? I want to just make one small comment on that point about this question of distributive justice, which I think it's an important point because I think that's a phrase that's been completely lost from the climate conversations. And I think, and in some senses, I think part of the conversation is in a sense the prehistory of that, right? It's a shift away from a principles-based agreement to this thing about saying where, and I think, by the way, I think from my point of view, it was a masterstroke by China. Because given where their emissions were going and given what if you looked at the trajectory, under any kind of a mechanism that talked about carbon budget, they were gone. So for them, this was actually a masterstroke to be able to actually have a bilateral agreement that got the imprimatur of another emitter and completely helped change the nature of the conversations where things like equity and justice that were part of the climate are gone. And so I think it's a little bit unfortunate. Even what counts for CBDR now is actually a shadow of what I think, to my mind, what it was supposed to be. So, so I think the distributive justice question it really is what you're saying. It's about powers trying to figure out what's the new economic landscape going to look like and how do we grab opportunity there. And even in that, I think India is not necessarily doing as well as it could. So anyway, I just wanted to put that out there.
Great. Thank you. We've got lots of hands, but I'm actually going to take the prerogative of calling on some of the expertise we have in the audience, which we absolutely have to hear from, and no more questions, I'm afraid. So I'm actually going to ask Ambassador Dasgupta, Mr. Sethi, and my colleague Lavanya, whose facial gestures during some of these comments just cried out for expression verbally, to please share a few words. So perhaps Ambassador Dasgupta, would you share a few, or if you prefer Surya to go first, and because I'm not surprising you.
Important points.
Let's hear from you.
I'm number one inventor. I represent India at X25. I'm filing patents for 45 years. Yeah. So why you are giving people on the same topic we are discussing the same thing. All the people.
Well, let's hear from them first.
Yeah, just want give me time.
Yeah.
Let me begin by saying that I've been very critical about the Paris Agreement. Everybody knows that. I've written extensively about it for many of the reasons which Ambuj has pointed out, and I could add a litany of more reasons to that. It's not going to work. It's not going to solve our problem. So that's let's keep that aside for the time being about Paris. I wanted to make three small comments. The first one is that this talk about solar having become cheap. First one is that our entire climate action plan was a response to external pressure. It had nothing to do with internal dynamics. So I was part of that first climate action plan, very much in the thick of it, and it was entirely exercise done because of external pressure to meet an external audience, not an internal audience. So that's number one. The second point I want to make is that this myth about solar having become cheap is exactly that. It's a myth. Okay, these numbers that are being touted are not real, and the losses are adding up in the distribution companies. And we will all pay for it sooner or later. So that's the second. People who think that solar is cheap, and I can give you reams and reams of data from every country that has gone into solar and tell you that that is not true. Now I've forgotten the third point, but there was a third point. What was it? Anyway, I'll come back to me and I'll mention that. Thank you.
Ambassador.
Thank you. I was very struck by what Professor Gallagher had to say about Mr. Obama's disappointment with what he managed to achieve at Copenhagen. Because actually I have the impression that he achieved a near miracle. He spent a total of about 4 hours in Copenhagen, right at the end of the conference. There was consensus in Copenhagen that it was headed for a disaster. Nothing was going to come of it. And then Obama managed to turn it around and to get, the Copenhagen Accord. And while he might not have achieved all that he wanted, the fact is that this was the first outline of a pledge and review agreement. And it was a turning point in the negotiations. So what we saw at Paris was really a culmination of that. A further reduction in the differentiation between developed and developing countries, etc. But I think what he did in Copenhagen was actually marvelous. So, he must have had even greater expectations of what he would achieve. But I think it was a stupendous effort on his part. Thank you.
Navroz, the third point was, I can say it without the mic, is that I first looked at it in 2006 when I made a presentation at UNFCCC. At that time, the bottom 50% of the world, where India sits, we are a lower middle income country. Lower middle income countries and lower income countries are exactly 50% of the world's population then, and they are 50% of the world's population today. We are less than 15% of the global emissions at that time. We are less than 15% of the global emissions even 12 years later. Now, so finding a solution in this half of the world is simply not going to get us very far. The truth of the matter is that unlike China, which got away with the past that I think it was union of the two devils actually, the Paris Accord. So I mean, where are we going to go from here? I mean, if this bottom 50% needs to raise. I mean, otherwise we are caught in a poverty trap. We are anyway going to perish. It's fine.
So, okay. Lavanya, could you give gentlemen just very briefly, please, for 20, 30 seconds.
Sir, I am technology expert. Every year, British Petroleum gives out the data of energy used in the every year. So we know, our emissions are going up. Every country's emissions and how they are developing. You see, this is the way to progress. Why we are giving 40-year-old data, Then the climate change was not an issue. I am a number one expert. I have worked in power station. Way back in '75. I know everything. Why you are discussing politics only? Why we are not discussing technologies? What India should be doing? For example, our railways, for example, they are not progressing. They are stagnant. Their throughput is stagnant. But air travel is going up, 100 times, 100% in the last 5 years. So we should be telling where we are making mistakes.
Thank
So
you for the comment.
So you are qualified people, you should be telling where we are making mistakes.
So you're very welcome to our discussions where we frequently talk about particular policy debates. This is a discussion about a particular episode of the US-China, so we want to focus on that for this session. Lavanya, please.
Thank you, Navroz. I'm not going to mount a full-on defense of the Paris Agreement because we'll be here all night. I could do it, but we'll be here all night.
You could try to do it.
You want to take me on, Ambuj?
We have the room
But I do want to make a couple of points about the Paris Agreement, both in reaction to what you said and also in reaction to Professor Menon's comments about the Paris Agreement not being implemented and actually very little of the climate regime being implemented. So, Ambuj, and not just you, I know there are other critics and skeptics of the Paris Agreement in the room as well. The Paris Agreement was located in the sweet spot between the red lines of 195 states. It is what was politically possible, and it was the most ambitious agreement that was politically possible at the time. There is, of course, a big distance between what was politically possible and what is environmentally desirable. Nobody disputes that. But what the Paris Agreement did was to set up a direction of travel towards what is environmentally desirable. And it set up an entire set of binding procedural commitments to ensure that we're eventually going to get there. We may not get there fast enough, we may not get there at all. But what is the alternative? I'd like you to tell me what the alternative is to this at a global level. Not right now. In that longer debate So it's a rhetorical question in a sense because I don't think there is an alternative to what we've got, but it doesn't mean that what we have is meaningless. And as far as actually the climate regime being implemented is concerned, every single commitment under the Kyoto Protocol was actually met by the countries that are party to it. At the end of the compliance period, we've done the compliance true-up. There's vast information on this. The UNFCCC demonstrates that the commitments were met. Now, it might be that the commitments were met because there was trading and various other reasons, but the commitments, the legally binding commitments under the Kyoto Protocol were met. And as far as the Paris Agreement is concerned, of course, the commitments are self-selected by parties, but there is, like I said, a direction of travel. There is an expectation, normative expectation of progression, and the elaborate sort of rules that have been set up under the Katowice sort of rule book, just negotiated a few months ago, set up very detailed requirements for transparency, which will create their own pressure on parties to actually implement what they said they were going to do. It's true that they chose what they were going to said they were going to do. It's also true we don't have obligations of result, but like I said, they're binding obligations of conduct, and they're buttressed by very extensive rules. So it is a very bureaucratic process, but that process is going to deliver insofar as the countries that have signed up and are committed to the Paris Agreement. Of course, that's not going to apply for the US, which was announced its withdrawal. But I'm fairly confident most other countries will actually meet their Paris Agreement commitments.
Thank you very much, Lavanya. I'm very reluctant to close this, but I think we do have to close this. I am going to take the chair's prerogative, if I can hold you up for another 3 or 4 minutes, to wander to the other side of Umbridge's wall, where I might find Lavanya.
and surprise.
But I think one can actually, stepping out the chair's role here to a slightly more partisan role, I think it's worth reflecting on the different underlying narratives that animate Paris and both the critics of it and the votaries of it. Ambuj said this is a global collective action problem. Indeed it is, but that's not the only way to look at it. From the other side of the wall, climate change is also a problem that is the aggregate effect of a lot of individual community, nation-state, collective behavioral decisions about economic activity. And the language, the academic language on that side, talks about this as a problem not of negotiating a global collective action solution, but of polyvalent and polycentric governance mechanisms, which says everybody tries to figure out how they can work on climate in the context of other complex challenges, and we'll see where that gets us, right? So the story there is a learning by doing dynamic, a direction of travel dynamic, and the key point there is not actually predicting, as an engineer would, exactly where you're getting to, but getting started and making sure you have mechanisms to learn as you go, right? From that point of view, getting started early is the most important objective. From that logic, Paris is not just a political compromise, it's actually a first best, right? So there is this other view out there. Will the learning by doing dynamic get us there fast enough? Nobody knows, but from that point of view, adding up the targets and finding that they fall short is not necessarily a predictor of failure. It basically says that depending on the dynamics within countries, you might overcomply your targets. And certainly, that seems to be the story people are telling about China, perhaps about India, and so on and so forth, right? So the targets are a floor, not a ceiling. The other side of the fence says, okay, we need a global collective action target, but we tried for 20 years, right? So the solution can't be, let's do what we failed to manage for 20 years. So this is two different visions. We are now trying a different vision that comes with an entirely different narrative, and the benchmarks for success and failure have to be different, not just an adding up of the targets. Just coming to the China story, I completely agree with Ambuj about the PR coup that China really pulled off. Because actually what matters is the area under China's curve. So the fact that China from 2005 to 2015 went on this incredible spree of adding carbon and came out, and I have a personal grouse here because at Paris I was on a panel where I was asked by some Norwegians, why can't India be more like China? And I thought, I was just flabbergasted. It's really rich. In other words, why are we not a country that has ramped up our emissions by 250% over a decade and a half and are highly energy efficient and so on? So China did pull something off. They have a chance of redemption if, in fact, I think they overcomply and they use the Belt and Road Initiative and the other trade platforms to export renewable energy rather than their coal capacity that they now have in surplus. So we have to watch and see. Dr. Ambassador Menon's pessimism globally, maybe the moment has passed for sort of a China-US happy marriage walking off into the sunset, as a la Kelly's final hand-in-hand imagery. But I almost wonder whether, if we had to choose now, if we could only have one leader of the climate debate, would we choose China or would we choose the US? I think we would choose China. So yes, the US remains important, but if China actually picks up this mantle of leadership, maybe there is something useful that can happen, given that China is leading the renewable energy industry, given that it's actually building these roads to Africa, given that it is flexing economic muscle in all kinds of ways. So I think that's something interesting to watch. What does this mean for India? Well, it means that India better start thinking about conversations with China, for one thing. On the renewable energy story, I actually have, if the goal of climate policy is to learn by doing, then Ambuj, whether or not China did the renewable energy target for mainly climate reasons or subsidiarily climate reasons or political, it doesn't really matter. What matters is what we've learned through doing it. I think the better example is actually the energy efficiency measures, which happened again because of climate, but have been really very, very productive. So I think one of the interesting things from this polycentric governance point of view is what machinery do you build, what institutions do you build, and what changes do you bring about through that machinery. Just the last point I would make is, again, picking up on something that Ambuj said about analytical capacity. Again, talking about India. We don't have really the supply of analytical capacity to do the kind of exercise that Kelly talked about. And that has been a persistent problem in India, and it's something we really have to deal with. And I'm very glad that Ambuj makes his life work to do something about that. But notably, nor do we really have the demand. At least not since Surya Sethi left government. So, we actually don't have many takers for our analysis. We don't have patient voices. We say, give us the answer, tell us what to do, or in some cases, give us the big marketing story, but not what's the analysis, and how can we actually make headway. So that, I think, is something that we can also take away from this story. Let me just close by thanking Professor Gallagher, Professor Menon, Professor Sagar. Thank you all very much. Thank you to the audience for all of your questions and for staying 20 minutes over. Really, really appreciate that.